So you've all had that moment while you're driving in your vehicle and you hit the brakes and it just sounds crazy and it's squealing, and you look around to make sure that it's actually your vehicle in the first place, and you're hoping that it's somebody else's vehicle, but then it turns out it's yours, and you start wondering to yourself, do I need to fix this thing? Is something wrong? Am I okay to drive this thing? Well, today I'm just going to run through a few of the quick reasons why your brakes are squeaking. The first few are going to be not really a big deal. The last few, they're actually going to be something you need to have to worry about and get checked. So let's just jump right into it. So one of the biggest reasons why your brakes are squeaking is usually right away in the morning. It's usually just moisture that's sitting on your brake pads or brake rotors. They kind of just form like a really thin layer of rust overnight, and then when you first start driving and it hits that rust, it's going to be squeaking a lot. But after a few times of pressing the brakes and you start warming up the vehicle, it pretty much wears that rust right off, and then it's going to be back to normal and the sound should dissipate. Another really common reason is actually just dust and debris sitting on your brakes. If you're sitting in a place with a lot of dirt and stuff blowing around in the air, it kind of just sits on the brake pads, or if you ever drove on a gravel road, you usually get some rock particles kind of sitting in there, and when you get back into town and you hit your brakes, it's going to be squeaky for a while. Again, not that big of an issue, just make sure to clean it off every once in a while so it doesn't start digging into your rotors or brake pads. So next is actually going to be just the style of brake pads. So there's 3 different kinds of brake pads. There's ceramic, organic, and semi-metallic. So the semi-metallic one's probably going to be the most popular. It usually comes on most vehicles. Sometimes it'll squeak right away when they're brand new, but that's usually kind of goes away after a few miles. So there's really not too big of an issue with that. The ceramic ones are actually going to be the most expensive ones. They'll last the longest, and they're actually usually the least squeaky. They probably will have no squeak at all. The organic ones are actually going to be the cheapest and probably the least durable brake pads you can get. But they're organic, so they're better for the planet, but they do create a ton of dust. So that dust, again, goes back to the debris like we just talked about, and that's going to make your brakes squeak a lot more. Also, just the way you're driving could cause your brakes to squeak. If you do a lot of like really hard braking, if you're one of those with a really heavy foot, and you gun it and then you hit the brakes, and then also if you go downhill a lot with like heavy loads or anything like that, it's actually causes a thing called glaze. So if your brakes are really hot, they'll pretty much get so hot that they're hotter than what the brakes are supposed to handle. So it'll kind of like melt it a little bit, and it'll pretty much cause just this glaze to go over the brake pads, so they won't have anything to really friction to brake against. So when you hit those brakes, it's going to be pretty much just metal rubbing against metal, and it's not really going to brake as good as it's supposed to because it's overheating, therefore causing a squeal. Now you might actually have an issue with your brake pads being too thin. If they get worn down too far, it will let out a loud squeal. These are ones you might actually have to worry about. If it persists for a long time, it's going to kind of sound like the rust and the debris one we were talking about earlier, but it'll be constant. It'll always be there. It'll never go away, because when your brake pads get down to a certain width, they'll be too thin in order to work, and they actually manufactured them to have a different kind of metal in that little section there, so it will kind of pretty much be an alert. So if you hear a loud squealing noise and it's persistent, that means your brake pads are getting too thin and you need to change them. So it's just an emergency kind of sound in order to let you know that your brake pads are getting too small. Now, if you're driving one of the older vehicles that have still have the brake drums in the back, most vehicles nowadays have the discs, but the brake drums, the older style ones, that might be due to a cause of lack of lubrication, and all you'll have to do is grease up some of the parts on the brake drum, and then that will stop squeaking for you. And lastly, it might just have a loose part somewhere down there. There's a lot of moving parts around there. There's the piston, the caliper, the rotors, the brake pads themselves, the lines, anything like that. If anything is loose, it might cause a squeal, which might be persistent. So now, again, if those first few that we talked about, really not that big of an issue, pretty much it'll go away after a few miles of driving and warming up the vehicle. The last few, if you're starting to hear squealing and it's persistent, something's wrong with your brakes and you need to get it checked out ASAP. Otherwise, it's going to lead to more money down the line and probably risking your life. So make sure, if you're hearing squealing and it's persistent, make sure to get it into your local mechanic and have them checked it out. Hope you guys found this handy. If you liked it, make sure to like and subscribe. Otherwise, we'll see you guys later.